We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
So my name is Charlotte Duval-Lantoine. I'm Ottawa Operations Manager and a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. I'm honored and delighted to be with you today with Carrie Buck to introduce her keynote address. A few words about our speaker. Carrie Buck was a career diplomat who was Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to NATO, Assistant Deputy Minister for International Security and Political Affairs, Assistant Deputy Minister for Afghanistan, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Director General for the Middle East and Maghreb. She led Canadian government task forces for Afghanistan, Russia, Ukraine, Syria, Mali, the Haiti earthquake, and other foreign policy and humanitarian crises. Throughout her diplomatic career, she supported prime ministers and foreign ministers at the G7 and NATO summits, represented Canada at the UN, G7, NATO, OAS, and OSCE on issues of human rights, security, disarmament, terrorism, and humanitarian affairs. She represented Canada on international negotiation of women, peace, and security issues from 1992 to 2018, helping build international law and practice on combating gender-based violence. Ms. Buck is now retired, but she is a senior fellow at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, senior mentor at the Canadian Forces College, and a member of the boards of the Conference of Defense Associations Institute and the Network for Strategic Analysis. Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you. I have to confess that this is the first time in 2 years that I'm speaking to an actual room full of people. During most of those 2 years, I think that we've all led an almost surreal existence, disconnected from the world while we were trying to protect ourselves against the virus, protect ourselves and our families from this existential threat. So I think we can take a minute to pat ourselves on the back for that transition. Although we are not yet completely out of the woods, although we haven't completely overcome this pandemic, the most serious for a century, we are slowly returning to a new normal.
Touched on most of the international events that scholars cite as having fundamentally reordered post-war global politics. So periods like the breakup of the former Soviet Union, 9/11 attacks, the Arab Spring, or the 2008 financial crisis. So I like to say I am the Forrest Gump of the Canadian Foreign Service. I've been witness to and worked on Canada's response to most of these transformative events. So the big question I've been reflecting on is how the pandemic will change our world. Are we again witness to a hinge in history where the fundamental building blocks of international relations will change in a dramatically short time? But I've also been thinking about the more difficult question, how Canada fits into this new world. How might this change Canada's international engagement, and whether we have the tools, the policies, and the people we need to continue to protect and promote Canadian interests internationally? So I'll turn to the big question first. What does COVID mean for the world order? Academics tend to gravitate between one of two poles. For some, the pandemic is a crisis. It'll reshuffle the decks, producing a fundamental reordering of the global system, while for others, the basic principles of the international order remain much the same. From my perspective, while COVID has laid bare and accelerated some trends, the major building blocks of the international order are still intact. But I see three broad trends that have occurred during the pandemic. First, most countries have turned inward. Second, in many countries, democracy and social cohesion have been shaken. And third, the world order is becoming more unpredictable, with shifting power dynamics among the major players and new sources of instability. So while the global order hasn't been upended, we are living through an unpredictable period of flux and of strategic surprise. And my view is that Canada is not as prepared as it needs to be to continue to influence and to lead in this new normal of the post-COVID world. So let me turn to the question of countries turning inward. In the aftermath of those big transformative events I just mentioned, there was quick and deep international cooperation. And this was largely channeled through multilateral organizations. For example, after the fall of the former Soviet Union, there was tight coordination amongst Western states on our foreign policy positioning, on the recognition of new states and democracy support, and on cooperation with Russia. And a lot of this coordination, it would happen bilaterally, but also on the margins and channeled through United Nations, G7, EU, NATO. Less at the UN, more at EU, NATO, and G7. Second example, 2008 crisis. When it became apparent there was quick coordination amongst the G20. I think one of our panelists mentioned that this morning. And that coordination was to help fend off collapse of the international financial system and make sure that governments didn't only fortify their own economies. And in the aftermath of 9/11, there was quick action at NATO to invoke collective defense in the NATO treaty, send aerial surveillance in support of the US, and in response in the years after 9/11 to the rise of terrorist groups, there was tight coordination through NATO, the UN, regional counterterrorism initiatives, and ad hoc cross-regional groups like the Counter-Daesh Coalition. Canada benefits when crises are multilateralized. It gives us a seat at the table, and in structured bodies like NATO, a voice and a veto. So what happened on COVID? Given the responses to previous events, I would have expected two related things to have happened inside Canada and in most countries. First, a realization that the threat was global. And second, then making that logical connection that solutions need to be global, but COVID was very different. For Canada, procurement of vaccines had to be global since we shut down our own domestic capacity decades ago, but our immediate reaction was not to take a global approach to the rest. We focused on vaccinating our own people first and making our own unilateral decisions on borders. But the politics of this are self-evident. I cannot think of a leader who would or could do otherwise. And I think our government did it brilliantly if we look across to partner countries, delivering more doses than Canadians needed ahead of schedule and ahead of most of the rest of the world. But stopping the virus in other countries is also in our self-interest. Variants of the virus develop in populations where the disease is allowed to run rampant, and these variants come back and pose an immediate and direct threat to Canadians. So it's in our self-interest, and sustainable solutions ultimately have to be global. But it wasn't until relatively late in the pandemic that Canada's focus started to shift to multilateral channels. But they're doing so now, we're doing so now, to coordinate international sharing of doses, countering vaccine hesitancy. Other donor countries followed that same trajectory as Canada, very much focusing inside it first. So what does this mean for the global world order? Does the fact that countries turned almost entirely inward, at least for the first year of the pandemic, mean cooperation and multilateralism are no longer the default? I think the fact that countries turned inward is due to three factors. First, COVID posed an existential threat to entire populations, requiring governments to focus on their own populations fast. And this is unlike previous big transformative events I mentioned, like 9/11 or the 2008 financial crisis, where the threat was real but more diffuse. COVID also hit different countries at different times, so international momentum created with an external, discrete, catastrophic event was slower to form. And this differs from the earlier Ebola outbreaks or 9/11, for example, where there was fairly quick international consensus on the gravity of the threat. I think the third reason that countries were slow in turning to multilateral channels was the inability of the WHO to cope with the speed and the scope and the scale of COVID. Now, Daniel Jean this morning said that WHO did much better on COVID than it had during Ebola, and that's true. I led part of the Ebola response in 2014, I think it was. So post-Ebola, the WHO had improved its capacity as a first responder to global health emergencies, but it was overwhelmed in this case because Ebola was more targeted, quicker moving, and restricted to fewer countries at the time. I also think that practical coordination and cooperative diplomacy at the WHO were slowed in the early days by other geopolitical factors, including China-US dynamic. So, international relations scholars, and I'm aware that I'm standing in front of a room of you, you've been talking a few years about the fraying of the international rules-based order and the slow death of multilateralism. So, is what we're seeing with COVID another nail in the coffin of the post-war international architecture? I don't think we're writing the obituary for multilateralism yet. On COVID, countries are starting slowly shift their focus to international cooperation and global solutions. Initiatives like the COVID Treaty at the WHO or agreements of the G7 to share more doses internationally, tackle supply chains. Maybe the fact that waves of COVID variants are lasting longer than any of us want or expect will revigorate the idea of global solutions shared across countries, channeled through multilateral bodies as the only way to dig us out of the pandemic. Yeah, I think that will be the case. So let me walk out of COVID and up to what this means for multilateralism and what I've seen over the course of the last couple of decades in negotiating internationally. I think we're seeing with COVID a trend that's been underway for quite some time. And this is a shift where states will pragmatically, increasingly forum shop for the right time, the right international organization, and the right negotiating bloc within those institutions to protect their interests, promote their values, or find solutions. And I call this messy multilateralism. States are able to choose a la carte among multilateral or plurilateral groups. So a few examples of how this works in practice. Negotiating blocs that might have once been fixed have become more fluid. States increasingly work across regions in interest-based coalitions, and the divide between the West and the rest is much less clear or distinct than it was even 20 years ago. And while in international negotiations, it has become more difficult than it was in the 1990s or early 2000s to secure consensus on some key elements of the liberal international order. I'll give you a few examples. Gender, human rights for LGBTQI, for instance, or larger scale peace support missions with protection of civilian responsibility to protect mandates. Those are harder to achieve, but there's still room for progress. So for example, at the last NATO summit, all allies agreed that climate security should be a focus. And in my experience, this consensus would have been unachievable even 5 years ago. So while these developments make multilateralism more complicated, it doesn't necessarily make it less effective. The fact is, most states still seek out cooperative solutions. Very few states choose to completely act alone because the disincentive or the cost of unilateralism is still too high for most. I think this is the case even for superpowers. President Biden is paying a reputational price at home and abroad for the US unilateral timeline on withdrawal from Afghanistan. President Trump before him damaged US credibility by his unilateral approach to a flawed Afghan peace process. And then when states do choose to act unilaterally, in spite of the isolation that ensues, as Russia did in 2014 when it invaded Ukraine, multilateral channels and norms are then used to call them to account and apply pressure to alter behavior. For states like Canada, the continuing incentive of multilateralism is that it amplifies our influence. The more we turn inward, the more Canada will be forced to follow others' leads. So for this reason, I think the majority of countries, including Canada, still consistently look to multilateral bodies for solutions. But my main point is that states aren't walking away from those bodies or from multilateralism. They're participating in it differently. It's just more untidy. There are many more states, many more stakeholders, many more complex issues than in earlier years. So in this new post-COVID normal of messy multilateralism, what does Canada need to do? And here's my prescription for the years ahead. First, states need to clearly articulate their interests so they can make strategic choices about what international fora, what partnerships to leverage. And I note here that the last integrated Canadian international policy review was in 2005, 17 years ago. States also have to diversify their range of partnerships to be able to count on a wider set of friends across regional divides. Canada has a very unique asset in our cross-regional network of partner states. We occupy a different personality internationally than our friends to the south or to the EU. So we're able to cross those regional divides. But what we do less well at is identifying priority relations based on our interests, and we don't systematically maintain them. I could give you South Korea or Mexico as two examples, but there are others. States also have to invest and continuously engage in priority international organizations to create those apertures, openings, and relationships so they can protect their interests when the next crisis hits. So this requires growing and retaining a professional diplomatic corps with multilateral knowledge and networks and deploying those people strategically to organizations like the UN or NATO. The UK, for instance, will identify an assistant secretary position at the UN. They know who they want for it about 5 years before, and they aim for it. We don't do that. We don't do it well. But I want to take this into a broader point about the importance of knowledge and networks. In a world of flux and strategic surprise, for Canada to be better able to anticipate and respond, we have to do a better job at diplomacy. Professional diplomats understand issues, countries, and regions in depth, and this allows them to identify early on opportunities for Canada to influence and to lead. They then use their international relationships built over time to turn these opportunities into action on the ground, whether it's bolstering peace, creating new markets, or development. Too many jobs at Global Affairs are filled with temporary staff, and promotion and retention don't sufficiently value diplomats' international knowledge or their international networks. There was a move inside the Canadian Public Service that dates back just over 2 decades where generalists were prioritized over expertise. And there was a reason for it that made some sense, a management reason, delivering public good reason. But there's a cost to be paid. So it's not just inside Global Affairs that trend has happened, but I think it's more acute in Global Affairs where you really do rely on Canadian expertise and knowledge abroad and those networks. So I would recommend not only a reassessment of our international policy priorities, but thinking about how we do foreign policy better on the ground. We need a top-to-bottom functional review of global affairs by those who have the background in international affairs to assess whether we're building the skills, the people, and the international presence we need to position Canada to flourish in a world where we could quickly lose relevance, influence, and an ability to foresee and prepare for big events. So let me turn now to the second effect of COVID I mentioned in my introduction, that of increasing polarization and political destabilization. The Economist this month cited a study of 133 countries that experienced pandemics or public health crises between 2001 and 2018. And that survey found that political unrest is fairly typical consequence of a pandemic, and that unrest usually peaks 2 years after. So if you thought 2021 was rough, we're not out of it yet. In fact, there's a great piece by Dan Dresner where he looks at, over millennia, plagues and pandemics and the serious political upheavals they caused. And he cites, in ancient Athens, Thucydides described the ways plagues shattered social norms. Quote, men not knowing what was to come of them just did what they pleased, coolly venturing on what they had formerly done only in a corner. So in that case, the plague caused not only a rise of recklessness and a lack of social restraint, but the decline of empire. So we might think about this when we're trying to figure out what's happening with anti-vaccine mobs in Canada or political unrest south of the border. As with my point about countries turning inward, the trend of countries diverging from democracy was already well underway before the pandemic. So Freedom House's annual index shows democracy has declined for the 15th year in a row. Nearly 75% of the world's population lives in a country that faced deterioration this past year. So if there was, during the Cold War, a shared belief that the Soviet Union and China would eventually succumb to the forces of liberalization and democracy, I think it's fair to say now that democracy is no longer the default. It's no longer seen as the default. Instead, we're seeing a rise of autocracies, including among close allies of Canada. We're seeing increasing polarization within countries, often as a result of disinformation campaigns, as we heard, expressly designed to create societal divisions. And you cited, Christophe Boucher cited this morning, UK, France, and US generated from within those countries COVID disinformation campaigns. There's a piece in the media, Canadian media, 2 days ago, but a CSIS report talking of Chinese government disinformation campaigns that were aimed at local Canadian diaspora media. So it's happening consistently, and it's happening from a number of quarters. I also expect we'll see more and more countries putting forward competing visions of democracy, of non-liberal democracy. So last 2 weeks, a campaign from Chinese sources started to appear that makes a case for China's, quote, more efficient version of democracy in contrast to the US. Be interesting to see if this heats up in advance of the leadership review for President Xi Jinping next year, later in 22. So I think the conclusion on democracy to be drawn is that the new normal is one where democracy is more vulnerable and where competition and conflict over democratic norms increasingly occurs in information spaces marked by digital tribalism and widening polarization. So, what do states like Canada need to do to be successful in shoring up democracy? Now, I hesitate here before I give you my to-do list for Canada because the Democracy Summit, I think, opened at 6 a.m. this morning, and it doesn't finish till tomorrow. So you can tell me at the end of day tomorrow, and in the year of action on democracy that follows, whether I got any of this right. So from a Canadian perspective, we've got some considerable assets when it comes to stable, functioning democracy. As one example, just think of the debates about vote counting during the last American presidential election, and give thanks to Elections Canada. But when it comes to shoring up democracy abroad, we've been less deliberate. So my prescription is the following. In our diplomacy and security and development programming, we need to take a deliberate, coordinated, whole-of-Canada approach to support for good governance abroad. Engage provinces, municipalities, media, and parliament, and focus on the things that Canada is relatively good at, like building the institutions essential to democracy. Second, in doing so, prioritize vulnerabilities like building credible independent media, election oversight bodies, or countering corruption. And learn from others, like the Baltics or Taiwan, about how to educate populations, including our own, to recognize disinformation, counter it using digital tools. Build our own regulatory and promotional tools, educational tools to protect the internet while blunting the societal divisions it creates. So, as I said, tomorrow night when that Democracy Summit ends, you can tell me how I did. Finally, I'll end on my third point by looking at which countries are leading, which are falling behind, what instability and new threats this introduces, and whether Canada is prepared. So for some time now, and we've all talked about it, China and Russia have been acting in ways that are less predictable and markedly more dangerous than in the past. So for Russia, beginning in 2008, reinvested in its military and started crossing European borders with armed force, beginning in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014. It also started engaging in gray zone tactics, activities like election interference, disinformation, or propping up autocrats in its immediate neighborhood. And now it's testing again, massing troops on the Ukraine border. Although it began well before President Xi Jinping became General Secretary, China, under his leadership, has become even more muscular, more visible, and more bellicose on international economic, military, and diplomatic fronts. But they have a global reach and an economic base that far outstrips Russia's capacities. And then I think, we've all talked about it, the US has been relatively weakened. First, by President Trump's rejection of alliances and embrace of dictators, but also by the US's relatively poor performance on COVID. I think one of the bases for power in international relations is trust in competence and good governance. And the US has been falling behind, or there's been some instability on both those fronts. So it remains to be seen whether this is a trend or an aberration that will right itself. And then as the major players, are jockeying for position, a complicated backdrop has been building for decades, with a much larger number of states from the South engaging in their own right on global issues. Unlike earlier decades, no one country or small group can set the rules of the game. So in other words, while the power dynamics might be shifting, this is not your grandmother's Cold War. It's a world filled with much more unpredictability, much more dangerous in a way because of that unpredictability, where Canada's closest neighbor might end up carrying less weight internationally. So I'll make 4 predictions for Canada in relation to these shifting geopolitical power dynamics and the new security threats. 1, we need to take a hard look at Canada's specific security vulnerabilities, prioritize and invest. My list? This would mean investing in the assets needed to protect our sovereignty in an Arctic that will be made more accessible by climate change, and at the same time, working with allies and rivals to keep warming below 1.5 degrees and keep the Arctic a conflict-free zone. It would mean dusting off our expertise and credentials in non-proliferation and arms control to reinvigorate weakening international norms in the face of new technologies and new domains. It would mean bolstering our intelligence capacities and our cyber resilience. It would mean working inside Canada with other countries to build societal resistance to political instability and polarization. But to achieve this, I mean, it's not a void inside government. Some of the recommendations from this morning, there are structures inside government. They're just not yet optimized, and I don't think we're ready for the next pandemic or the next big crisis. So what do we need to do? We need to increase security literacy, this is my second point, across the federal government, the provinces, and the private sector. I would recommend regular whole-of-government integrated threat and risk assessments that end up with some kind of public statement that look across security, social, environmental, and economic sectors. If national security threats can emerge from non-traditional areas like climate change, and we know they can, pandemics, or mass migration, then our intelligence analysis needs to be able to predict longer-term trends. And our national security architecture needs to be flexible enough to bring in players from across all of those sectors. And it has to be set up in a way that will engage Canadian citizens. Because if inside government there's a growing understanding of the threat and risk environment that isn't understood by Canadians, it won't stick. So it has to be part of an invigorated national conversation. There's a pitfall here. If you securitize everything, you securitize nothing. But I think it's very clear that there is that threshold on all of the issues I mentioned where there's a clear security dimension and we don't talk about it enough. Here I note that Canada hasn't had a national security policy review since 2004. Third, same point I made about our diplomacy, I think I can make about the people and the architecture that we need to deliver reinvigorated security policies. So I think a very serious discussion has to be had about the role of the CAF in responding to domestic crises like the pandemic and climate crises. They're called on, and as Danielle Jean said, they're not always the right port of call, and even if they are, they're not mandated or equipped or adequately for it, and that conversation with the provinces and municipalities about the division of labor hasn't happened in a sustainable fashion. But we also need sustainable forces to do this, and I think this moment of dealing with sexual misconduct, allegations of abuse of power within the military, although it's shaken the military to its core, the fact that there are 18,000 plus complaints coming to the system is a very good sign. And I've seen the Canadian Armed Forces rewrite themselves after major crises and learn from major crises in the past. So we need to have a sustainable CAF that can do all the things we need. We need to get through this hump and to do it absolutely solidly and see it as an ongoing job for all of us. And then fourth, Canada's response to security threats has to be complemented by our international engagement policies and posture, and vice versa. So it's a truism that there's no single security threat at home that doesn't have global roots or global solutions. And the more we turn inward, the more Canada will be forced to follow others' lead internationally. And it would be a mistake to default to an American lead. That would make us a client state, and it would be risky if US leadership or even its political stability were ever to wane. And we've carved out our own space in the world before. In the period after World War II, we did the work to define our policy goals and make a distinct space for Canada in the international architecture being constructed at the time. And since then, we've managed to consistently lead and influence. We've got significant assets, but we're not a major power. We've learned that an approach to international engagement of walk softly and carry a big stick does not work for us. Megaphone diplomacy, walk loudly and carry a small stick, or take too long to deliver on commitments, has limited results and damages our credibility. So while in some instances, Canada's international strength has been in numbers, more often, Canada has made its mark by leading with Canadian ideas and effective diplomacy backed up by action. More than a few examples, and they're not all Suez. Canadian leadership in the Ottawa Landmines Treaty, human security, protection of civilians, women, peace and security, our deployments to Kandahar, Haiti earthquake, maternal and child mortality initiative, battle group in Latvia. You'll have your own list. We can do it, but I sense that there is a little bit of rust out happening on some of our architecture and our people and our policies, civilian and military. So maybe the 2 years we've spent locked inside our houses and inside our countries dealing with COVID give us that window of opportunity Canada can use to maintain and build on our long-standing position of influence and leadership. But as I said, we need to reinvest in our capabilities, people and networks, so that we can be ready for that new normal of flux and strategic surprise. Thank you.
Time to get set up and maybe have some water or anything. I think that what really strikes to me is that things have accelerated during COVID-19, and these are trends that we have seen in the past. But also what I really like is that Canada has had a knowledge on how to cope with some of those issues. We've had a strong diplomatic corps in the past, and we've been privy to important conversation and been leaders on some issues. And so it is very encouraging to know that maybe it's just getting the rust off rather than just creating new capabilities out of nowhere. Maintenant, je vais passer en français pour poser une question et après j'ouvrirai la période des questions à l'audience, autant en ligne que dans la salle. J'aimerais prendre un pas en arrière et parler de compétition entre les grandes puissances. Donc, ce qu'on a vu avant Covid et même durant la présidence de Barack Obama,
and indeed during the Obama presidency, was a certain transition of the international intent towards Asia-Pacific region that was previously placed in suspense with the invasion of Crimea. Asia-Pacific is now at the heart of all strategic discussions now. Has COVID had an impact or accelerated that transition? Thank you, Charlotte. That is a rather difficult question to answer. You may recall the pivot towards Asia under Obama. That took place in 2011, if memory serves. Just after the death of Kim Jong-il, the United States saw a potential opening or opportunity. And three things happened relatively quickly after that. Firstly, very quickly, there was a reaction from our European allies, or those of the US, I should say, who feared that turning towards Asia, the United States risked cutting down their security investments in Europe. So we were starting to talking about basically a 180-degree turn where it would turn its back on Europe as it turned towards Asia. But then in 2015, Xi Jinping came to power, and in the first years of his mandate, of his term, China was transformed very quickly into a more, not quickly, but quickly enough, into a bellicose position. And the year after that, Mr. Putin crossed into Ukraine. So the world changed relatively quickly after that pivot towards Asia, fast enough so that we could observe a break. The US were still turned eastward because everyone knows that we have to support our allies in the region and be wary of Chinese actions. But it wasn't about turning the whole machine towards Asia. With respect to COVID, I think it had a slight impact, indeed. It blocked cooperation, diplomatic cooperation within the WHO. And there were some ridiculous debates sometimes on the origins of the virus, but in the backdrop at WHO, some aspects worked very well, notably the exchange of scientific information, and Chinese was participating. So maybe that COVID example could direct us towards our next discussion, how to cooperate with rivals, because it relatively worked. Thank you very much. At the back. Thank you, Ms. Buck. Sorry, I'm all the way at the back. I hope you can see me. My name is Jonathan Paquin, professor at the political science political science faculty of Laval University. You really set things up wonderfully for our session, what Canada can do in a transforming world with more and more rivalry between the large powers. That's this afternoon's session. You mentioned at the outset that Canada must identify and verbalize its interests. We don't always have the feeling that Canada knows what it wants and seeks. And a white paper or policy statement was one of the recommendations I think that you made. And it's been 17 years that we haven't had one in Canada. And some consider it to be a waste of time between the moment that the assessment starts and the publication of the document. The world has changed. I have my own ideas on this, but I'd like to hear yours. As Australia and several of our allies are very active and are positioning themselves and publishing important strategic documents, why are we absent from that arena? Is that symptomatic of a much larger problem? The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Freeland, at the time, gave a remarkable speech in June 2017 at the House of Commons. It wasn't a white book, a policy paper, but there were clear lines in our foreign policy. But since then, we feel that it hasn't been followed up upon. I'd like to hear you, considering your experience, why are we delaying so? I imagine that there are various explanations. Firstly, there was a Harper government and now a significantly different government. I'd like to hear you on this. Thank you. Well, thanks for the question. I will answer in English because I do think about these matters in English, and since we're a bilingual country, here I go.
Anglais, assez
And
souvent.
this way, I sometimes speak English.
So, yeah, I do think we need a better articulation of our interests. Personally, I find the juxtaposition of values and interests false and not a very helpful construct. In a country that depends on a rules-based order, having other countries respect human rights, for instance, is both efficient and it helps maintain those rules. So it's in our interest and also our values. Because the tendency has been to devaluize devalorize the values, and anyway. But we don't have that history of setting out our interests. We have periodically done foreign policy reviews, and I'll tell you two things that have been said about them. So once there was a British diplomat who said, we don't do foreign policy reviews, we do foreign policy. Although surprisingly, they issued an international review very recently. But also the second thing that's been said is that previous foreign policy reviews didn't end up making much of a difference because we didn't prioritize. We wanted to do everything. So I'm of two minds, honestly, whether we do a foreign policy review, a new book. We don't have that history of regular white papers, so it would be a big one-off, or whether we use other vehicles. I do think Minister Freeland's speech was a roadmap for our foreign policy, and I don't think it's shifted under this government. So it was very helpful setting that out. But what it didn't do, and what a foreign policy review or whatever does, it engages Canadians across the spectrum and across the country. So I think the bigger gap is actually engaging Canadians in what they want us to do internationally. Because I don't see a lot of pressure at the political level to engage more internationally, but I think that is quite achievable for two reasons. Leadership matters, so if you signal that international is important, it becomes more important. And we already know, I think CIC did a survey in the summer asking Canadians how much they cared about international, and they do. So there's a place to do this, but we need a broader national conversation. So choose your vehicle for that. Maybe it's a foreign policy review, maybe it's something else, like Joe Clark did a parliamentary-led review in the 80s, for instance. But something I think is needed. But behind that, I actually think there's a bigger gap in the public service capacity underneath. I was really surprised when the previous clerk said, it was cited in Maclean's, that it's not the job of public service to generate policy. Well, that's news to me. I actually think it is the job to generate policy ideas and recommendations, right? And particularly in something like diplomacy, and it's not just foreign affairs that does, global affairs that does diplomacy, it's done across the system. Particularly in something like diplomacy, I said, you need to be able to identify opportunities for Canadian influence and leadership, right? That's a policy reflex. Then you have to bring it home and make it government policy and put it into action. But you have to know and have the space to do it out in the field, so you need that expertise, you need the knowledge. So I think I honestly think we're in a bit of a dangerous rust out period, which is why a review of our policy without a deep think about the capacities we have would be pretty dangerous. And when we do that around capacities and around policy, we have to take a whole of Canada approach. In the early years of foreign policy, we focused on things that Canada was really good at. Agriculture. We're good at that, right? Fisheries. We're really good at fishery management. Is that figuring as a priority for something we do through our development assistance? No. Health security, we're probably better at it now than we were a few years ago, and better at it than some of our partners. Is that figuring in a lot of our international engagement or our development policy or foreign policy? No, it isn't. So I don't know what the answer is, but something.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left. We have a question online, and I know that we have Steve Seidman that wants to ask a question. So Steve will take your question, and then I'll ask the one online, and you can hopefully group them together. I hope that they're not like too far away. So Steve, take it away, please.
Okay, put some pressure on me, Charlotte. That's great, to try to anticipate what's online. So you already answered half of my question, which is the public service up to doing a foreign policy review? The other half of the question has to do with the government side of things, which is a two-part issue. One is, does this government care about foreign policy at all, right? Because there has to be some impetus from on top to actually do this kind of thing where they actually raise questions that might lead to uncomfortable answers. And that leads to the second thing, which is prioritization, right? There has to be a desire to actually make decisions. One of the problems that people talk a lot about how successful the SSE was for defense. But if you go through that document, it's really hard to figure out where they made choices, where they made priorities. It was just everything mattered. And there's very few things that are left out of the document. And now they're trying to remember that, oh yeah, the North matters, so we're trying to jam in modernization as an implied part of the SSE, even though good luck finding it. And so the question that comes to with a foreign policy review now is how do we incentivize this government this day to actually do it, whatever form it takes? And then part of that is having, what are the incentives for them to actually make choices? Because choices means that some people win and some people lose. And this government's really good about kicking the can down the road so that way they don't have to face those choices.
And the question online is on something completely unrelated. It's from former Chief of the Defense Staff, General Eno. He says NATO has in-depth planning, coordination, and C2 capability and a broad-based deployable resources. To what degree has NATO included the response to a pandemic into its planning process? So good luck answering that in 3 minutes.
Okay. I'm not with the government. I left in August, but I have been with the government for 30 years. So I actually firmly believe in that principle of apolitical, nonpartisan. And I also believe that this is not this government thing or the previous government thing. I think it is a thing that has been building up over the last few mandates, honestly. But from my experience working with this government very closely, with this PM and previous foreign ministers, yes, they care about foreign policy. And, when I was at NATO, we occupied a very important leadership role. Jens Stoltenberg said to me, I cannot overstate how important it is, Canada's contribution, Canada's leadership of the Latvia battle group. We hadn't had, we'd had sizable number of troops in the Balkans before, but those were regular rotations. We hadn't had a semi kind of long-standing presence of troops in European soil since the current Prime Minister's dad pulled most of them out. This was a big deal. The leadership of the training mission in Iraq, and I'm just citing NATO examples because that's what I was working on. There are others that were from headquarters. That was a big deal. That was a big leadership deal. So I think the answer is firmly yes. And I cited carefully those examples of Canadian leadership. They ran through a lot of the previous governments of both political stripes. So we've got the instinct, and we do, it's not, arid field, scorched earth. We do have those skills, and we have some of the finest diplomats and some of the finest military thinkers amongst our allies. We do. We can be extremely proud. It's just needs a bit of what is it? You take the Brillo pad and you scratch some of the rust off, and then you figure out where the metal underneath needs to be reinforced, and there's some metal reinforcing that's needed. Choices. No, we never make choices. But part of the problem is that one of our aims, because of who we are and where we sit, will always be, aims and ends in themselves, will always be alliances, right? And diversifying our alliances, and that's a legitimate aim. So yes, we join every club, but that's not a bad thing for a country like Canada, because we diversify our partnerships and we share risk by creating more alliances around the globe. So choices are made, in terms of where money goes. Choices are made in terms of where people go and where embassies are set up. But we do have to have a world global coverage that sometimes exceeds our population and our budget base. I don't know what to do about that. It's also hard, so choices are made, but it's also hard for governments and bureaucrats to go out there and say, okay, well, we didn't actually do this, right? It doesn't help with the exercise of building public support for what you are going to do, which I think is sorely needed. I think we need more domestic conversations. And it doesn't have to be the government that always does this, back to your point. I think that there's a lot of space in academia and in civil society to lead and generate a lot of those conversations. It's not just about pushing the political level, it's about creating networks and creating experience, expertise, and interest, which in a way, COVID can be an opportunity. And General Huneau, I left NATO in 2018, so I don't know exactly what's happening right now, but I do know, because I keep in touch, I do know that there's a very serious and quick response of NATO to operational support on COVID response. It was immediate and impressive. I do know that on other kind of emerging security threats, that there's some serious thinking inside NATO, like climate security, about how to integrate that into planning. And I do know that the Madrid summit coming up this summer will come out with a revised strategic concept. So right now, NATO is thinking through very, very carefully its core tasks. I think that's something that it would be great if people were to focus on that and, issue views. I have my own. Personally, I wouldn't want post-Afghanistan NATO to think that it doesn't do crisis management forever. I think that would be the wrong choice. And I think it has to integrate those new and emerging security threats in a very real way into its planning looking forward. So I personally hope those things will happen in the new revised strategic concept. But negotiations are happening right now. So the short answer is I don't really know, but I told you what I wanted. So if we can all push in that direction, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, with those hopes and those wishes, I would invite you all de remercier Madame Carrie Buck. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much.
Les Français dans la salle reconnaîtront cette phrase, mais sans transition.
You may recognize this sentence, but without a transition, I'd like to call up Rony Filiatro for the essays.